according to the mainstream theory, so I'll deal with that first, what happened in China is that it privatized the economy, or the majority of the economy, and as a consequence of that, of this process towards capitalism, the economy grew. Because capitalism is the best system in the world, and it's the most efficient system, and therefore, as capitalism grew, China grew. That's the argument that is the mainstream argument. The theorist behind that is the main theorist behind it is a guy called Barry Norton. And he's an American expert on Chinese affairs, and he's the guy who made the basic thing. He wrote a book called From Plan to Market. So this was or Growing Out of the Plan, that's what it's called, Growing Out of the Plan. So that's the basic theoretical framework. I don't agree. I think that what actually happened is, and hardly anybody has written about this, because the assumption was that because a market economy was growing in China, that the market economy became dominant, and that the planned economy became subordinate and basically disappeared. That's the fundamental argument that's being made. I don't agree. I think that the planned economy, and by planned economy I mean the planned utilization of resources. See, the difference between socialism and capitalism as theoretical abstractions is the following. Capitalism is a system of producing commodities for profit, to sell on the marketplace, which spontaneously organizes. So I go and buy I think to myself, I can make money selling water in Hyde Park today. So I go to Sainsbury's, I buy 500 bottles of water, and then I come over and try and sell them, right? So spontaneously, my desire to make money drives an economic activity within society. And capitalism is a system that is supposed to be governed by this law, that anybody who wants to make money can make money by buying and selling, and in particular buying and selling human labor power, right? And producing commodities for sale. So that's the fundamental structural outline of how the capitalist system functions. A socialist system was supposed to be different to that. How was it supposed to be different? Well, it was supposed to be different because under socialism, you were supposed to say, now there are 500 people in the park and they're thirsty, and we are going to supply 500 people with water because they are thirsty. Not because I can make money out of it, but because they are thirsty and we're going to supply it. So it might appear that the same thing's going on. 500 people get 500 bottles of water. But actually, the driving force organizing it in one circumstance is me getting money. In the other circumstance is a planned approach towards thirst. They're two different methods. Now, in that particular circumstance, they have the same result. 500 bottles of water, 500 people getting them, right? But as a generic social force, they have a different result. So if an economy is dominated by private individuals owning private companies and deciding to invest to make profits, that the dynamic of that economy and society and human activity within it will be organized entirely around that structure, or overwhelmingly around that structure. So for example, employment, unemployment, housing, healthcare, education, television, shops, services will be governed by private accumulation and private profit. If on the other side you've got a society in which you plan what is done, then the approach is totally different. You'll be saying, what are the priorities for social need? So what are the priorities in healthcare, education, social services, welfare, housing, clothing, and so on, that we want to address? And how will we address them? What resources are available to meet those needs? How do we calculate them? And how do we mobilize them to achieve the objectives that we set ourselves? So it's quite a different dynamic. Marx called the one capitalist thing, he called it the law of value. You would probably know it as market prices and capitalism. That's probably how you know it. In general language, that's what people say. They don't say law of value. The law of value is the term that Marx used for the spontaneous organization of an economy by capitalism. Okay? Planning principles, and that's what basically Marx proposed, would govern the society after capitalism. So A society that wanted to meet human needs would plan the use of resources to meet the needs that they prioritize. So if we say we want people to retire at 50, you could pass a law, people will retire at 50, and then you organize the resources to meet the needs of the over 50s who have retired, right? So it's a different way of organizing the society. Now, in a country like China or the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, you had a dual process. Because capitalism was overthrown, in other words, the state power, the machinery of weaponry, armory, judiciary, politics that represents business, private ownership, if that's overthrown, then what governs, what organizes the society? Now, you obviously still have, you're in a society that has got market relations, but you overthrow the government and state of that old system. So what are you going to introduce in its place? If on the one side you say, okay, we just let the market continue, then the truth of the matter is the new market relations or the old market relations will reassert their domination and forces will mobilize to overthrow the existing system. So the alternative is you defend the new system and you organize a strengthening of planning. So you say, for example, we will provide everybody in Britain with a 30-meter apartment minimum space, and that is the starting point of our decision, right? So the priority number one in society, housing the population. It's an example, it's not a rule, an example. For example, in the last 5 years in China, a priority was set, mandatory priority, in the current what's called the 12th five-year plan. And in that 12th five-year plan, 36 million apartments are to be built for the population. Those apartments provide about 30 meters of accommodation per person. They have housed in the last 5 years 100 million people based on those principles. They are not market-driven principles. They are state-planned principles. So, what does it mean if we say we will build, say the equivalent of what they've done in China, we would build in England, that or in Britain? That would mean roughly building 5 or 6 million apartments in 5 years, the next 5 years, providing 30 meters each, yeah? Now, what does that mean in terms of what happens to the economy? It means if you prioritize that as a planned measure, not as a market-driven, a planned measure, what does it mean? It means we need to get the concrete, we need to get the steel, we need to get the furniture, we need to get the electricians, the plumbers, the water supplies, the infrastructure, the railroads, the transportation, all the things that people will need because you have planned to build these buildings to house the people. So the entire dynamic, like a magnet, driving the economy is different. Like iron filings round a magnet, the economy will mobilize around the central directives determined by society and the state. It could be democratic, it could be dictatorial, but the question is it planned or is it private? Is it governed by market forces or by planned forces? So, in the case of China, why China has become what many people say is the biggest economy in the world is because that is what they've done. They've organized the economy by planning. Planning determines the central motive force within society in China. And around those motive forces, private companies mobilize their activities as sidelines to the general plan. So if you're building 100 million apartments, the equivalent of all the apartments in Britain, or better said, all the apartments in England and all the apartments in Germany in 5 years. If you're going to do that, then the entire activity of the private sector will galvanize around that central activity because it's dominant, it's the dominant force shaping the direction in which society moves. That is why, for example, in China, the issue of migration, like we're seeing between Europe and Africa, is not really an issue in the same way as it is here. 300 million people, a third of the population of our, or 25% of the population of Africa, have moved in China in the last 30 years. Now, in Europe, there's nothing like that. They say, 2,000 people, 5,000 people, how can we possibly cope? But in China, tens of millions of people move to the cities almost every year from the countryside. And now that might sound like, oh, so what? That's internal to China. No. China's countryside is like Africa. Chinese cities are like Europe. So when they move from the countryside to the cities, it's the African-European migration happening inside China. And the next 20, 15 years, the same process is going to happen again. Another 250 million people will be moving to the cities. That can only, if that happens in a country or in India or in Africa, basically you get massive shanty towns. Millions of people living in squalor with no facilities, no healthcare, no education, no resources. In China, what they're doing is formalizing. There's a different regulation. It's like in the European Union. If you're a member of the inner core of the European Union, you can move to Europe. Like the Romanians sleeping on the grass over there, you can move to Europe. You can live in Europe. You can work in Europe. But if you come from Ukraine, or you come from Russia, or you come from Zambia, or you come from the Ivory Coast, and you come to England, you don't have any rights. You're illegal and you live on the parameters of society, right? You might work as a slave or sex slave or cheap labor, but you don't have any rights, right? So, in China they have a process of formalizing these rights. At the moment, for example, between now and 2020, that's 4 and a half years time, 100 million people will be moved from informal to formal status. That's like moving 100 million Africans to the European Union in 4.5 years. 4.5 years. So the argument that you cannot take migration in the way that the UKIP and the British government and so on state is a complete lie. And China is far poorer than Europe. Far poorer than Europe or the United States of America. Per capita, China, about $10,000 US. In fact, some bit less than that. Per capita. But in America, it's $55,000 US per capita production. So it's far more wealthy, but less able to achieve objectives of urbanizing, modernizing, and developing. Because America and Britain and Germany are governed by the law of value, by private profit dominating society. How do I prove this? This week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, a man by the name of George Osborne, he said, we are going to privatise Royal Bank of Scotland. 80% of the shares owned by the government. And he said, we're going to make a loss when we do this. I think it's £7,000 million we're going to lose. But you're going to be better off because the private sector knows best. So we only nationalised the bank to help the private sector. So when we use public resources, like the reason why, for example, your children or your children's children will have to pay so much money for education, is because we took the money from their future and bought Royal Bank of Scotland with it to save the private sector bank from going bankrupt. Now we've saved the private sector bank from going bankrupt, we give it back to the private sector without getting back the extra money. And that money is to be made by squeezing the poor people of Britain and blaming them for the crisis because one of them has got, claims social security when they're unemployed.
They're refusing to release figures on the number of elderly and disabled people that are dying since they've had their benefits suspended.
Well, of course, because that type of data is not suitable for general public knowledge.
IDS is refusing to release the figures.
Well, it's not good for the public morale,
Yeah.
And we need, in an economy like Britain, because things are driven by sentiment, after all, we're told the market governs, and if you turn on the television, or you look at the newspapers, you look at the Financial Times, they got 4 pages of numbers with lots of little names of companies you never heard of. And those numbers govern our lives. Most people don't know what they mean, but they govern our lives. And then on television, they'll say, now for the business news. And on comes the presenter and says, the markets were jittery today. America has caught a cold. Maybe England's going to get the flu like that lady there. No. That's what they're saying. So they say that the market, inanimate system of organising production, the market has got human qualities. It suffers from illnesses, like human beings. It is a living entity, like a human being. In actual fact, it's an inanimate object. Under capitalism, inanimate objects control living human beings. Human beings are dominated by inanimate objects. For example, the most wonderful thing to be dominated by, apart from a dominatrix, is money, right? Because I can own a 5-story house in Mayfair, but it's not really as good as owning £7 million that the house is worth, in inverted commas. Why? Because the money is universally convertible to any commodity you could imagine having. That's why owning the house is not as valuable as owning the money. Right? The money, the inanimate object, representing the past labour of human beings, that money is an expression of power relationships in society. Why does private ownership dominate society? Because private ownership is the coagulated form of dominating other human beings. By owning money, you have power over other human beings. By owning that money power, you can control the way in which human beings act. If I have £5 million and I chuck £700 on the floor and say, dance upside down naked, someone will do it.
You don't have £700.
You'll do it.
And how many people can dance
He's
upside
volunteering.
down?
He can.
I've never known you to any more than a couple of pounds in your pocket.
My friend, you have a very poor memory. You have a very poor memory. Yes. Thank you very much. Now this week, just to illustrate the relationship between China, you may have seen I made the Evening Standard yesterday. If you didn't, you're fool.
No, you didn't make it yesterday. It was
What
only
did-
Friday.
what happened
It doesn't come up this
yesterday?
Saturday.
Good point. Friday. Good point. I have it on my iPhone if you want to see
What
it.
happened? What were you? Why were you in?
Because on Monday,
Yeah.
I was employed by a Chinese bank.
Yes.
And that Chinese bank
And on
is,
Tuesday, they made you unemployed for being useless.
I was employed for 1 hour for 1 hour by a Chinese bank.
To do what?
Explain. Wait for it.
We haven't got time. We've got to go out there and
Go
work.
away then.
For 30 years during my meetings.
Yeah, but that adds up to.
So
about
I'm sure
half an
you've got
hour.
plenty of time.
Go on.
Now, for 1 hour I took the CEO of Haitong Securities. Haitong
Never
Securities.
fucking heard of them.
I took them. It's the second largest investment bank in China.
That's why you've never heard
I
of it.
took the CEO and the CEOs of a Portuguese bank
To a lap
Bessie,
dancing club.
near a lap dancing club.
Oh.
Next door to the lap dancing club
Yes.
is where Karl Marx lived.
Highgate.
So I did a walking, no, it's in Dean Street. I did a walking tour
Yes.
of Karl Marx's life. I had to finish at 10:30 on the dot
Yes.
because they were being picked up by chauffeurs, taken to the stock exchange to open the stock market. So
But they wanted to see
in order
Karl
to
Marx.
open the stock market, you must first come on the Karl Marx walking tour. Lesson learned. I'll show you the.
Did they give you a tip?
I got £200
Excellent.
and an article out of it.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll find it for you here.
Were they nice?
The CEO of the Chinese bank was very nice, very friendly.
Which of the Chinese languages did they speak? Mandarin.
普通话. 普通话.
Can you speak
Mandarin.
it? Mandarin. Very good.
Please worry, but I didn't do it in Chinese actually, I did it in English.
Excellent.
Well, I'll find it for you in a few minutes.
Yeah, thank
In any case, the point being,
I'll check it online.
that here was Western capitalism in London in the stock market, thinking that they are welcoming Chinese capitalism into their lion's den.
Into the bosom.
Whereas actually what was happening was the guy who's in charge of the Chinese bank is called Wang Kaiguo, and Wang Kaiguo is one
One Kaiguo is a unit of currency.
Kaiguo in pinyin.
Right.
Now, Wang Kaiguo is also not only the chairman of Haitong Securities
Yes.
and the director of the stock exchange in Shanghai, but he's also the
Communist.
secretary of the Communist Party in the company. and a communist. So the
The
question
dirty
is,
red
why
bastards.
is a state-owned company in China
Yes.
engaging activity in Britain? Because what they want is, they want the desperate investors of Europe and America and the rest of the world to throw money at Chinese state-owned companies, so that Chinese state-owned company can invest in resources like housing, healthcare, education, construction and development. For example, in China, in the last 10 years, they have built high-speed rail network. I looked at the map, it looks like the tube map of London. And it now incorporates every single city in China. Over 500,000 people is connected by high-speed rail. High-speed rail means more than 200 miles an hour. 200 miles an hour.
The plan was to export it into the rest of London and the rest of
They are doing that.
about it.
What are you talking about?
Why? What are you doing down here anyway? Piss off back to
In
Scotland.
Africa, they are built. In Africa, they are building exactly the same network as they built in China. Every city in Africa,
You Scots are
over
never
500,000 people will have a high-speed rail network connected by the Chinese.
They're going to come into Europe.
Even London to Birmingham is being built by the Chinese. So what are you talking about?
I'm talking about
We can't understand what you're saying. Speak in English.
The British government are employing the Chinese to build their railway for them.
success, mate, you know. A route when it's seen the most single-digit companies in the world.
He's a maladjusted
Are
Scotsman.
you
He's
talking
not going to
about?
say anything.
Go back to Scotland.
Yes, back to Scotland.
What about the accident they had a couple of
You
years ago?
racist.
Are there no accidents? God's sake, German wings crashed a couple of days ago. Malaysian Airlines crashed twice a year.
Nobody knows what you're talking about.
Yes, Mr. Ice Cream. Shut up!
This is a great Chinese system, yes?
Fucking Chinese.
Do you talk to me like that?
I'm describing the dynamics in answer to a question. What is driving the Chinese economy? That's what I was asked.
It's anything to do with communism, that's fine. It's a super Western capitalism. Yes.
Well, why is Western capitalism failing in Western capitalism but working in a communist
I'll
country?
tell you. Cheap labour.
Cheap labour?
Yes. Cheap labour,
Is
wages
labour
are way,
cheaper
way,
in
way.
Vietnam?
What?
Is labour cheaper in Ukraine?
It's also, listen,
Sorry?
let's remember two things about Vietnam. One, exports from Vietnam are rising very, very fast. That because there's 1,200 million people in China, naturally, you would not expect it has an enormous economies of scale. Vietnam has the same. Nonetheless, because it's a smaller country, it will work
My
better.
friend, are the wages in Haiti higher than the wages in China?
Yeah, that's a silly question.
No,
No, they're not.
They're not.
Are the wages in Ukraine higher than the wages in China?
no,
They are not.
they're not.
And therefore, the argument that cheap labour is the foundation of the Chinese growth is wrong.
No,
It's wrong.
For
For example, I just pointed out 100 million people in China in the last 5 years are being housed or have been housed in public sector housing, council housing to you and I, right?
What's that
Now,
interesting?
what is that if not part of the social wage, right? It provides people in Britain, they're going, oh no, we can't have council housing anymore. Sell it all, right? Sell it all. But in China, they're building council housing. Now, why are they doing that? Because it's part of the social wage for the population. If you have a welfare state and a social wage, it improves your general living standard. If you have council housing and you live in London, it allows you to have a stable life. If you have private housing and you live in London, you have a completely unstable
They're
life.
moving them out to Luton,
Yes, or
Birmingham,
bloody God knows
Manchester.
where, that's right. Even Peterborough.
Yeah,
Now, where are we?
we're in Hyde Park, sir.
You carry on.
I like the economies. You're talking about a system in China which is in no way communist.
I didn't
It's
say it
rude
was
to be
communist.
eating an ice cream and tour.
I didn't say it was communist per se.
The government's communist.
I said the government claims to be communist, and there is a contradiction in Chinese society between markets on the one side, which exist on a large scale, and planning on the other side. What I was arguing was that planning dominates the economy in China. Planning dominates. Now, that force which dominates determines the direction which society moves in. So because planning dominates in China, the Chinese economy can move more rapidly to develop than any other economy in the world.
So you're saying that the mixed economy?
I'm saying it's an economy dominated by planning. No, an economy that is both equally balanced between planning and markets will inevitably tip one way or the other.
All the banks are
It
controlled
will
by the
tip
party.
towards
That's not a
capitalism,
mixed
or
economy,
it would
is
tip towards a planned economy.
All the banks, are they not controlled by the party?
All the banks are state-owned
How is that a
banks,
mixed
apart
economy
from
in the
so-called
classic
pink man.
sense? That's not. That's a centrally controlled economy by any definition. Look, finish your ice cream because I'm not prepared to discuss important matters of state while you're eating a bloody Ronald McDonald ice cream.
It's not Ronald McDonald.
No, I'm joking. This man can be taken seriously because he chooses not to debate subjects while eating a child's ice cream.
I'll come back to your point now. Then I'll call to it.
Didn't your mother tell you it's rude to point?
What are you doing, you two?
This planned economy is only temporary because China still has to catch up with America and the rest
Why is it catching
Western
up?
Europe.
It's setting the example.
Stalin had 5-year plans. It weren't supposed to last forever.
The difference in China is this. Under Stalin's regime, and in the Soviet Union really until 1989, almost everything was publicly owned. And in China, only a minority of the companies in China are publicly owned. So, in China, 120 companies are publicly owned. These companies, through subsidiaries, own about 150,000 companies, right? The land is publicly owned, and in townships and villages there are companies which are half-half, hybrid companies. But the decisive levers, the top companies, are all, or nearly all, publicly owned. The consequence of that is you can plan and you can also exploit capitalism. I say that again. You can exploit capitalism. What does that mean? It means that, for example, if that company, the Speaker's Corner Cafe, makes £2,000 today and it puts it into the Royal Bank of Scotland, today the British public, in theory, make a gain of £2,000 from that private company. Unless they withdraw it all and spend it all, it belongs to the public. Right? Now, if that public bank serves the needs of the public, in other words, if Royal Bank of Scotland invests 80% of its money in public works and social programs, then it is a transfer exploiting the private sector to serve the public. That's what happens. But unfortunately, in Britain, Royal Bank of Scotland belongs to the public, but serves the private sector. 80 to 90% of investments by, or loans by RBS go to the private sector, not to the public sector. In China, 75 to 80% of all bank loans go to the public sector, not to the private sector. So the private sector is milked by the state to transfer the milk, butter and cheese to the general population. That's the difference.
But this gentleman's made an interesting point. Where will China be in 10 or 15 years? If all economies evolve, where is it evolving to?
This is an important question. What decides the balance of forces in society? The balance of relation of